Adjusted this. Doesn't feel right. Really fussy as well. If you've been coming to the church here over the last months, you will know that we were following under the title A Wild Messiah for a Missional Church. So we've been making a journey through the Gospel of Mark. Not the whole of Mark, but a selection from the Gospel of Mark designed to highlight aspects of Jesus that should then shape our own understanding what it means to be the church. And we're going to finish that series today. We're going to finish in Mark chapter 15, which may surprise you because there is a Mark chapter 16. But we actually did Mark chapter 16 on Easter Sunday. So for a little period, we fell into following the liturgical year, the lectionary, and we took the passages from Mark that were relevant to that. That's why we finish in 15 rather than 16. And I'm going to read from verse 16 and following. Quite a few verses, but they are important to be heard and read together. So Mark chapter 15, reading from verse 16. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is, the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, the King of the Jews." Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spat on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country. And they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was night in the morning when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified two rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he cannot save himself. Let this Messiah come down from the cross that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." I wanted to open the sermon with two quite large quotes from the book that has the title, A Wild Messiah for a Missional Church. I really hate reading long quotes in a sermon, so I came up with this solution. If you can show the video, Timothy. According to Michael Frost and Alan Hirsch, Jesus was a wild one. I want to read a couple of quotes from the end of the second edition of their book. "Jesus was a good man, but a wild one. He was a threat to the security of the religious establishment. He was baptized by a wild man. He inaugurated his ministry by spending time with the wild beasts in the wilderness. He was unfazed by a wild storm that lashed his boat on an excursion across a lake, and with the wildness of the demoniacs of the Gadarenes. And while he ultimately brought peace to both those situations, in neither instance did Jesus appear overwhelmed or frightened by the circumstances. There was an untamed power within him. And elsewhere they say this: in the pages of the Bible, Jesus is presented as a system-toppling, brown-skinned Son of God who raised the dead, healed the sick, empowered women, wept with the broken, embraced the marginalized, opposed the proud, turned culture on its head, and was killed by the very ones he came to save. Killed by the very ones he came to save. Some would say that's what his wildness got him. Killed by the very ones he came to save. That's what his wildness got him. And not merely killed, but killed by crucifixion. Somebody's not happy out there. In this book, Dominion, which was given to me to read by the Duffins, I've read it from cover to cover. I would love to say that. But in this book, Dominion, by Tom Holland, he opens this book by describing the crucifixion. And he does so because, according to Holland, one way or another, the Western mind has been shaped by the Christian faith, which is a faith based upon a belief in the crucified Messiah. He writes, "No death was more excruciating, more contemptible than crucifixion." He notes that Roman intellectuals saw it as a deliberate means of terror, here I quote, to keep the scum in their place. Crucifixion was not merely a means of execution, but was a means of humiliation. It was not merely a punishment, it was a deterrent. And Holland, I think, does as good a job as anyone I have read in explaining how, for the Greco-Romans on the one hand and the Jews on the other, the idea that somehow God would become human and could die with crucifixion was so incomprehensible as to be ridiculous. The idea that God could become human and could die by crucifixion was so ridiculous that it was an idea not merely to be rejected, but to be mocked. And Paul, church missionary, whose job in many ways was to interpret the crucifixion and preach it into the world, he of course understands this and speaks about it in the book of Corinthians, where he says that the crucifixion was a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. Indeed, Holland also makes a really interesting idea. He suggests that crucifixion was such a contemptible act that even those who acknowledged Jesus as Christ might flinch at staring the manner of his death full in the face. Holland points out that Christian writers never really represented the crucifixion in artistic visual form until several centuries after it had happened. And the first real visual representation of the death of Jesus on the cross was a piece of anti-Christian graffiti written on a school wall. And in that piece of anti-Christian graffiti, there was a picture of a figure on a low cross with a donkey's head and someone kneeling beside it. And the inscription says, Alexamenus worships his God. Here is one of the first ever representations in history of the crucifixion. And this kind of mockery was very common at the time, for Christians were accused of worshipping the donkey's head. And the whole idea was it was an utterly ridiculous and foolish idea. The crucifixion as a means of execution was so contemptible that it was not merely to be rejected, but to be mocked. Of course, the gospel writers are among the people who represent to us what happened in the crucifixion. Although they often do so, if you read the accounts, they show a lot more restraint than was shown, for example, in the film The Passion of Christ, which went into great detail about how Jesus suffered, but the gospel writers are much more restrained in their description. And when we look at Mark's gospel, it seems to be that one of the things he's trying to focus upon in telling us about the crucifixion is the mockery that happened around the event. So if Mark has a slant in telling us about the crucifixion, if it's something that he wants to highlight from it, he wants to highlight the mockery. Mockery from the powers that crucified him. Who were they? Military power and violence, populist mob rule, narrow religious institutionalism, the powers that crucified him. And behind all of these, the forces of evil, which Jesus had contended with since the beginning of his ministry. Martin Shaw, in his book Liturgies of the Wild, says, hate is the Satan of love, and that Satan is present in these events. And so in our passage, verses 16 to 20, we have the mockery from the soldiers. They represent Jesus as a sort of tortured human mannequin, and they say to him, Hail the King of the Jews. In verses 29 to 30, we have got the mockery from the crowd who ridicule him. If you are so clever, come down from the cross. Come on, let us see it. You can do it, sort of thing. In verses 31 to 32, we've got the mockery from the chief priests and the religious leaders who jeer, you save others, but you cannot save yourselves. And Mark, right at the end of verse 32, says, and even the people crucified with him hurled insults on him. If there was music to go to this scene, and if again we were drawing the music from the Psalm playlist, I think it would be Psalm 22, verse 7, where we read the words, All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. Here, though, we need to push into the story. For Jesus' crucifixion is not merely the consequence of his wildness. Jesus' crucifixion is an expression of his wildness. Here is the biggest, wildest move of all. Can he turn mockery to majesty? Seems risky. We're told that the soldiers gambled for his clothes, and Jesus was a gambler. I knew I'd come across that phrase somewhere. Could I find it? At first, not for the life of me. I searched around. However, I did come across the song, The Gambler. One time sung by Johnny Cash. Apparently it was more popular than the Kenny Rogers version. How could that be? Nevertheless, in the song The Gambler, there are the following lines. It says this, every gambler knows that the secret of survival is knowing what to throw away and knowing what to keep. To those who witnessed the crucifixion of Jesus, it must have seemed that he had made the wrong gamble, throwing away his popularity, his power, his dignity, and life. This was too wild a move, and it left him shrouded in darkness, abandoned by God, and breathing his last. But here is the turn. As Mark presents the mockery, he wants us to get the dramatic irony of what is happening. Dramatic irony is when we see something, but our knowledge helps us to see it differently. Dramatic irony in a film would be when there's a person in a shop, say a woman standing at the cash desk, an innocent enough looking woman standing, waiting to pay, and someone breaks into the shop with a mask and a gun, and he tells the woman, "You stand over there. If you get in my way, you're for it." But we all know she's a highly trained FBI agent. And so we see the story differently. That's what dramatic irony tries to do. And here Mark wants us to get the dramatic irony of what is happening in the crucifixion. The early church writers, sometimes called the early church fathers because they were all men. Let's put that differently. The records we have existing in history are from the men. And so they're sometimes called the early church fathers. And they got this. They understood about the dramatic irony of the crucifixion. And if I was to riff off of some of what they wrote, it would go something like this. He was dressed in purple robes, but these could not compare with the robes he had taken off to come to earth and be a human. He was mocked as King of the Jews. He was the King of all the earth, through whom all things that are created have been created, and in whom all things now hold together. He was covered with the spittle of his revilers, when only a few days before his own spittle had helped people who could not see again, had helped people who could not hear again, and had helped people who could not speak again. He was hung beside outcasts and bandits, but this was no shame for the one who had welcomed tax collectors and sinners. He had his arms nailed, stretched out wide. Didn't they know that from the beginning of his ministry, he had held his arms out wide to welcome everyone, including children, the marginalized and broken? He was called out for failing to destroy the temple. The temple would fall, and a new temple would be built in the lives of his people. He was offered wine vinegar to drink, but on the cross, he was drinking the cup of salvation. They mocked him that he had saved others, but could not save himself. He was still saving others. And that is how Mark wants us to read the story, to see the dramatic irony of what is taking place in this event. And as Mark comes to the end of his description, he indicates something of the transformative power of Jesus' death. Verse 38, the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." The exclusionary practices of the temple are over. All people now have access to God. God is no longer contained within the building. And an important confession is heard from a Roman centurion. This man was the Son of God. And as the centurion speaks, the mockery becomes majesty. I knew I was looking for the phrase, Jesus was a gambler too. And I found it. It was in a poem by Stuart Kennedy, who was also apparently known as Woodbine Willie. He was a padre during the First World War, and he wrote this poem. And sitting down, they watched him there, the soldiers did. There, while they played dice, he made his sacrifice. and died upon his cross to rid God's world of sin. He was a gambler too, my Christ. He took his life and threw it for a world redeemed. And ere the agony was done, before the westering sun went down, crowning that day with its crimson crown, he knew that he had won. Mark wants us to see, like the people who had been blind, to whom he gave sight. Mark wants us to see the majesty leaking through the mockery. For the thing that the powers could not see was how such an act was an expression of love that would completely nullify all of their actions by him taking them, embracing them, and breaking them. In the words of C.S. Lewis, the love of Jesus expressed in the cross was a deeper magic that evil could not understand. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians, none of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified him. For in crucifying him, what they did became their undoing. He showed them up for what they were. He took their power and he triumphed over them. Colossians 2:15. So it is that when you and I read the story of the crucifixion, we know it's not the man on the cross, but rather the military might and violence, the populist mob rule, and the narrow religious institutionalism. We know that they are actually the criminals in this story. And insofar as all these powers represent a greater evil, hate is the Satan of love, it lost. For when all is said and done, we gather here today and we actually worship the crucified Messiah. And every time we do it, again and again, we turn their mockery into majesty. We're going to be led in worship before we move to communion.